In 1939, archaeologists cut open a green hill in Iceland. Under the grass, they found a farmhouse, sealed there since the year 1104, when the volcano Hekla buried the whole valley in ash. The roof timbers had rotted away centuries ago. The walls were still holding their shape, walls made of grass, cut from a wet field with a scythe, stacked like brick and left alive. For 1,000 years, this is how Iceland built its homes, not because turf was anyone's first choice, but because it was the only material the island had left. And those soft green farms carried families through hurricane winds and Arctic winters that modern buildings in the same country cannot face without repair crews. A new house today is designed around a 50-year life. These farms ran for 1,000. Tonight we take the turf house apart, wall by wall, down to the one idea that kept it alive for 10 centuries. How does a country end up building out of grass? Start with what Iceland lost. When Norse settlers landed in 874, at the height of the Viking Age, they found an uninhabited island with birch woodland covering roughly a quarter of it. The Landnámabók, Iceland's medieval book of settlement, remembers the coasts as wooded from mountain to shore. The settlers did what settlers everywhere did. They cleared land for hay, grazed sheep on the saplings, and fed the trees into charcoal pits to smelt bog iron for axes and scythes. On most of Europe's frontiers, forest cleared this way grew back within a lifetime. On Iceland it did not. The island sits just under the Arctic Circle, the growing season is short and cold, and sheep eat every seedling that dares to try. Within a few generations the woodland was essentially gone, and it stayed gone. 1,000 years later, forest covers barely 2% of the country. Icelanders had removed the one building material every other northern culture depended on, and no timber trade could fill the gap, because imported wood crossed a dangerous ocean and cost accordingly. Stone was everywhere, but Icelandic volcanic rock breaks irregular and porous, and there was almost no lime to make mortar. What the island had in unlimited supply was the ground itself. Turf is not mud. It is the living root mat of a grassland, a dense tangle of roots, stems and soil that holds together like woven fabric, and in the wet valleys of Iceland it grows thick, heavy and tough. Icelanders learned to harvest it the way other nations quarried stone. With a special turf scythe, a cutter sliced the field into long strips called strengur, or into thick diamond-shaped blocks called klömbrunás. Cutting had its season, early summer, when the root mat was strong and the ground soft enough to work. A good cutter read the ground the way a timber buyer reads a log. Turf from a dry gravel slope crumbles inside a decade. Turf from a proper wet meadow, dense with sedge roots, holds for generations. Farms with fine turf on their land were known for it, and the material was judged, compared and argued over because everyone lived inside the answer. There was one more property that made turf worth betting a family's winter on. It handles water the way a hillside does because it is a hillside, just rearranged. Rain hits the grass, runs along the root mat, and sheds down the face of the wall instead of soaking into the core. The outer skin stays alive, keeps growing, and keeps knitting itself back together, a repair crew that works for free every summer. No other building material on Earth patches its own weathered surface. Stone cannot, brick cannot, concrete certainly cannot. A turf wall in good condition is not slowly wearing out in the way a painted wall wears out. Its surface is being replaced from within, season after season, for as long as the roots live. The wall itself was engineering, not stacking. It started on a footing of dry-laid stone, no mortar, which lifted the living wall out of standing water, the same move a modern builder makes with a foundation course. Above that, the turf blocks went down in a herringbone pattern, each diamond leaning against its neighbours, course after course, with loose earth packed between the inner and outer faces. A finished wall stood 1.5 meters thick, sometimes two. The herringbone was the quiet masterpiece. Turf shrinks as it dries and settles, and blocks laid flat open long, straight seams, ready-made channels for wind and frost to pry apart. Laid diagonally, every shrinkage crack dead ends against the flank of the next block. The wall could shift, compress and swell with the seasons without ever opening a passage from the storm outside to the family inside. The builders could have stopped there. They did not. Inside the turf shell stood a skeleton of precious wood that carried the roof, so the walls bore only their own weight, and the frame never touched the weather. Iceland found that wood on its beaches. Driftwood, pine and larch from Siberian rivers rode Arctic currents for years before landing on the north coast, salt-hardened and dense. Drift rights were written into law and sold with farms, because a good driftwood beech was worth more than good pasture. When a large trunk came ashore, word travelled up the valley the way news of a whale stranding did, and the wood was hauled home, split and rationed out beam by beam over years. A single ship-sized log could frame a church. Over the rafters went turf again, one layer grass side down, a second grass side up, so the roof came alive as a meadow. Its pitch was a calculation with no margin in it, too flat and rain soaked through into the house, too steep and the turf drained so fast it dried out, died and blew away in the next gale. The old farms cluster inside a narrow band of roof angles, because outside that band the roof does not survive. Then the weather arrived to test all of it. Iceland's coastal winter is not deep, steady, continental cold. It is violence. Storms come off the North Atlantic with wind that peels sheet roofing from modern barns and sends it across the valley, and between the storms the temperature crosses the freezing line again and again, all season long. That freeze-thaw cycling is the quiet killer of rigid buildings, in Reykjavik and in the northern United States alike. Water slips into a hairline crack, freezes, expands with a force no material fully resists, and wedges the crack wider dozens of times each winter. Every February, the same physics lifts the corners of asphalt shingles and blows out mortar joints from Chicago to Oslo. It is a large part of why concrete in Iceland spends its whole life under maintenance and why the country's engineers publish papers on cracked facades. A turf wall barely notices. The material is elastic, laced with air pockets and living roots. It takes the frost in, flexes and settles back. Wind that works a rigid wall apart finds nothing to grip on a rounded green hillside, and a turf house is exactly that. Grass roof, grass walls, low profile hugging the ground. The storm reads it as landscape and passes over. Inside, that mass of earth did something else. 1.5 meters of packed turf holds warmth the way a thick blanket does, taking heat in slowly and letting it go slowly, smoothing the wild swings outside into a slow curve inside, which raises the question that should have doomed Iceland from the start. Warmth from what? The forests were gone. Peat and dried dung were burned under the cooking pot, but they were too scarce to burn day and night for comfort. Norway heated its winters with wood. Britain dug coal. Iceland had neither, and the price of that poverty was written into the architecture. Kitchens moved to their own turf outbuildings, fires shrank to what cooking strictly required, and a nation at the edge of the Arctic found itself living in a well-insulated house with nothing to put in the stove. There was not even a stove. It turns out the warmest room in Iceland usually had no fire in it at all. The family lived, worked and slept in one communal room called the badstofa, and on many farms that room was heated by bodies. Human bodies, and on the cleverest farms, cattle. Builders set the badstofa on the upper level and put the cowshed directly beneath it, so the animal's warmth rose through the floorboards all winter. A cow gives off heat like a small stove, steadily day and night, and it fuels itself from the hay the farm already had to make. People slept two to a bed under woolen eiderdown, and the room stayed livable through a polar night with no fuel bill at all. And no, I am not making that up. Those winter evenings even had a name, the kveldvaka, the evening wake. While the wind screamed over the roof, the household sat shoulder to shoulder in the warm, dark, carding wool, knitting, braiding horsehair rope, while one member read the sagas aloud or recited rhymes from memory. Iceland came out of the Middle Ages with one of the most literate peasant populations in Europe, and part of the credit belongs to a heating system that forced everyone into one room and gave them nothing to do there but work and listen. The architecture did not just keep the nation alive, it kept the nation's stories alive, in the same room, on the same nights. The house was a system that ran on grass 3 ways at once. Grass walls to hold the heat, grass as hay to feed the cattle, cattle as the furnace. On an island with no forests, that loop kept a nation alive at the edge of the habitable world. None of this has to stay on a screen, by the way. The channel exists because this kind of knowledge is something you can put your own hands on, and the easiest place to start is not a turf wall. It is food. If this makes you want to make the past instead of just watching it, that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way Store. It starts with the Medieval Bakery Collection, 3 guides. The Practical Recipes book walks you through real medieval loaves. The Sourdough Manual is for building and keeping a living leaven of your own, the old way. And the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find proper heritage grain. The bread is where the hands-on part begins. While Icelanders were perfecting their system, the rest of Europe was building in exactly the opposite direction, in stone and brick, toward walls meant to stand untouched for centuries. Iceland could not afford that ambition, and the gap between those two philosophies is where this story has been heading all along. A turf wall dies. That is the material's one unbreakable rule. Roots decay, blocks compress under their own weight, rain gnaws the weather side, and somewhere between 20 and 70 years after it was raised, depending on the turf and the site, a wall needs to come down and be rebuilt. By every modern instinct, that verdict should end the argument. We would call it a defective product and demand our money back. The Icelanders folded it into the design. A farm never rebuilt everything at once. This decade the south gable, next decade a stretch of the long wall. The roof strips on their own faster cycle. Rebuilding was a chore, like haymaking, done in the slack of summer with a scythe, a sledge, and a neighbour's help, using material cut free from the home field. The skill travelled with the seasons. Children learned to judge turf by walking behind the cutter, and a farmer who could lay a tight herringbone wall carried that reputation the way a smith carried his. Nobody mourned a wall. The house was never finished, the way a field is never finished. It was farmed. Pay attention to what that did to time, because this is the detail that explains the 1,000 years. When archaeologists dig at Icelandic farm sites, they find the buildings standing on mounds, and the mounds are not natural hills. They are the compressed remains of every earlier version of the same house, layer upon layer of old walls, floors and hearths, sometimes metres deep. A single farm is its own archaeological record, a book where every rebuilt wall is a page. At Kelda in the south, a turf hall with medieval timber in its core still stands on land farmed since the age of the sagas. At Glaumber in the north, the turf farm now kept as a museum sits on a mound that was already ancient when its current walls went up in the 1800s. The house you can visit is young. The home underneath it is 1,000 years old. That is the trick hiding inside the title of this video. No single turf house survived 10 centuries. The design survived by dying on schedule, over and over, on the same spot, and every generation that rebuilt a gable renewed a contract the settlers had signed in 874. Now hold that against the way we build. A modern house is finished the day the crew leaves, and everything after that day is decline. Its walls are sealed sandwiches of drywall, plastic film, insulation, and cladding, layers glued and nailed into an assembly that cannot be opened without destruction. When a 30-year roof fails, nobody rebuilds it with material from the yard. A machine tears it off, and a truck hauls it to a landfill. Try to repair just one layer of a modern wall, the vapor film, say, and you will find you have to destroy the 2 layers in front of it first. The assembly is cheaper to replace than to open, so replacement is what the whole industry is priced around. You do not need to live under grass to borrow the idea. Builders who study the turf tradition point to 3 things worth stealing. Choose materials that fail gradually and visibly. Wood and lime plaster over sealed films, so trouble announces itself while it is still small. Design so that layers can be opened and closed. Screws over glue. Boards over laminates. And put a maintenance rhythm on the calendar the way the Icelanders put rebuilding into the summer, because a house inspected every year almost never surprises you. A sod-roofed garden shed laid over a proper membrane will even teach you the old roof pitch problem in miniature, and it costs a weekend. In the United States alone, construction and demolition work now produces around 600 million tons of debris a year, roughly double all household garbage combined. That figure is the sound of buildings that cannot be repaired, only replaced. When we left earth and timber behind, we did not just change materials. We quietly gave up the idea that a building is something you keep alive and accepted something closer to packaging, sized for a mortgage and priced for a single use. To be fair to the people who walked away, the turf house asked a price that is easy to romanticize from a distance. The rooms were dim, lit by a few small windows and fish oil lamps. The air was close, shared with smoke, wet wool, and the cattle below. The walls breathed moisture in a climate that never truly dries, so damp was a permanent tenant, and in that one crowded sleeping room, disease moved fast. Doctors of the era condemned the farms, and they had their reasons. When cheap timber, corrugated iron, and concrete finally reached Iceland in the late 1800s, people left as fast as they could afford to. As late as 1910, roughly half the nation still lived inside turf walls. 2 generations later, almost nobody did. The last turf farms were inhabited into the 1960s, and then a building tradition that had run without interruption since the Viking Age simply stopped. It stopped so completely that within 1 generation, the skills were rare enough to alarm the National Museum. Today, a small core of craftsmen keeps the technique alive on the museum farms, relaying walls the old way, 1 gable at a time, so the knowledge survives in hands and not just in books. Icelanders are not sentimental about it. Their grandparents remembered the damp. The country now keeps its finest turf farms as museums and has proposed the tradition for UNESCO's World Heritage List, which is its own quiet ending. A thing becomes heritage at the exact moment it stops being ordinary. Stand back far enough, and the 2 philosophies trade places. The turf house looked temporary and behaved like something permanent, renewing itself against the storm century after century. The modern house looks permanent and behaves like something temporary, aging from its first winter toward a demolition crew. One treated decay as a schedule and planned the repair into the household year. The other treats decay as a surprise, discovers it through failures, and pays for it in debris. Between those 2 attitudes sits most of what we spend on our buildings, and most of those 600 million tons. Back in the valley Hekla buried, the excavated farm at Stung has been roofed over to protect the ruin, and nearby stands a full reconstruction raised with the old methods in 1974, herringbone walls, driftwood frame, living roof. Step inside during a storm and the wind goes quiet in a way no drywall ever manages. The settlers who raised the original knew their walls would not last. They were right, and 1,000 years later, theirs is the idea still standing. We dig up building knowledge the modern world dropped. Subscribe for more. What surprised you most? The cow-heated bedroom, the living roof, or the house rebuilt for 10 centuries?